It was supposed to be a typical press stop for Denzel Washington, promoting his new historical drama set to release later that month. He had done the Circuit Fallon, CBS Mornings, even a surprise walk-on at The View. But Good Morning America was scheduled to be the big one. ABC had promoted the exclusive interview for days, advertising Denzel Unfiltered with George Stephanopoulos. Viewers tuned in expecting insight into his acting process, maybe a few laughs and reflections on the state of Hollywood. But what they got instead was a tense, uncomfortable exchange that quickly spiraled out of control live in front of millions. By the time the segment ended, Denzel had stood up, removed his microphone, and stormed off set. George looked frozen. Robin Roberts sat in stunned silence, just chaos. Asterisk, it started quietly, almost imperceptibly. George opened with softball questions about the film, asking Denzel what drew him to the project, how he researched the role. Denzel, always poised, gave thoughtful responses, mixing humility with his signature gravitas. But then, out of nowhere, George shifted gears. "Let's talk about power," he said, leaning forward. "You've portrayed powerful men on screen, but what about off-screen? There have been whispers that you're intimidating to work with. Do you think your presence sometimes crosses a line?" The studio audience tensed. Denzel blinked slowly. "You calling me a bully, George?" he asked, voice steady but tight. George gave a half-smile. "I'm saying there are reports from the past directors, even co-stars, who say you can be intense, maybe even domineering." Denzel's jaw clenched. "You want to talk intensity? Let's talk journalism." Asterisk, what followed was a slow-burn dismantling of George Stephanopoulos' line of questioning. Denzel began calling out the selective framing, the vague, unnamed sources, and the broader trend of media weaponizing intensity when it came to successful black men. "Let me ask you something, George. He's passionate. When I demand excellence, I'm difficult. What are we really talking about here?" The audience erupted in applause, which producers tried and failed to quiet. George tried to pivot, offering a clumsy defense about public perception and context, but Denzel didn't let go. "This ain't your courtroom," he said sharply. "Don't act like you're cross-examining me. I came here to talk about art, not defend my humanity." Asterisk George, caught off guard, attempted to lighten the moment by joking, "Well, this is certainly one way to go viral." Denzel didn't smile. "You think this is a game," he snapped. "You get to sit here with your notes, your curated facts, and throw words like bully around because you've got commercial breaks to fall back on. I don't. I've got my name, my family, my legacy, and you don't get to stain that because it makes for Good Morning TV." At that, he calmly removed his mic, stood up, and said directly into the camera, "To the people watching at home, I respect you too much to stay in a room that doesn't respect me." He walked off as the audience gasped. George muttered something, inaudible as the producers quickly cut to a stunned Robin Roberts, then to black. Asterisk, the fallout was instant. Within minutes, the clip went viral on every platform imaginable. Hashtag Denzel Washington began trending alongside hashtag GMA and hashtag George Stephanopoulos. Some viewers were horrified, accusing George of ambushing a guest for ratings. Others praised Denzel's refusal to be cornered. "He spoke truth to power on live TV," one user tweeted. "That's real courage." Meanwhile, public relations experts scrambled the tone or spirit of the show. George posted nothing. Robin, caught in the middle, simply retweeted a quote, "When dignity is attacked, silence is not an option." That tweet got 1.2 million likes. Asterisk, later that day, Denzel released his own statement via Instagram. A simple black screen with white text that read, "There is a difference between a difficult man and a dedicated one. Know the difference." The comments exploded with support Hollywood peers like Viola Davis, Kerry Washington, and even directors like Spike Lee and Christopher Nolan backed him publicly. Meanwhile, leaked footage from backstage showed George pacing, visibly rattled, and asking producers, "Did I go too far? George, what did you expect?" The moment quickly became symbolic of how powerful media personalities can lose control when they forget who's sitting across from them in the days that followed. Denzel's walkout became more than just a media event hit, became a cultural moment. Editorials were published, podcast panels dissected the confrontation. and morning shows ironically tried to spin the narrative back in their favor. But the momentum was with Denzel. He was invited to appear on The Breakfast Club, and unlike the scripted questions of mainstream TV, Charlemagne Thagard opened the show bluntly. "Yo, Denzel, was that the moment you decided to stop playing there?" "Game." Denzel smiled, but his tone was serious. "I've never played their game. I've just been quiet about how it's played around me." That hour-long conversation went viral for entirely different reasons. It was candid, raw, and deeply introspective. He spoke not only about that interview, but about the burden of being labeled safe in Hollywood, the coded language that tracks black excellence, and the media's appetite for conflict disguised as journalism. Asterisk, meanwhile, George Stephanopoulos was nowhere to be seen. He skipped the next 2 days of GMA, with ABC claiming he was on personal leave. Rumors swirled that top executives had pulled him aside and warned him about the backlash. George's inner circle insisted he was misunderstood, that his intention had been to push for a deeper narrative around fame and behavior, but few were buying it. Critics compared his questions to past interviews where he'd handled far more controversial guest politicians. CEOs, even accused criminals with far more care. The inconsistency was glaring, and for many, it confirmed what Denzel had said. When a black man commands the room, suddenly the rules shift. By Friday, ABC's viewership had dropped nearly 12%. Protest hashtags began circulating, sponsors quietly distanced themselves. Asterisk, at the same time. Denzel's movie, which hadn't even premiered yet, saw a huge surge in interest. Pre-sales skyrocketed. Wasn't lost on his team. The interview meant to humanize the film's lead had tried to vilify him, and instead it made the project a symbol of integrity. When asked if he planned to return to morning shows, Denzel responded during a press junket, "Not unless they remember who they're talking to." His words weren't bitter, they were resolute. The industry had long relied on Denzel as a safe bet. Articulate, composed, gracious. But now, they were seeing a side of him they weren't used to. Unapologetic, confrontational, and it was electrifying. Asterisk, behind the scenes, ABC executives began scrambling. The damage wasn't just about one host's misstep, it was about optics, about diversity, about how the network handled its guests, especially black men in positions of power. A confidential memo was leaked showing internal debates. Should George publicly apologize? Should GMA issue a formal retraction? One executive wrote, "We can't afford to alienate the audience that actually trusts Denzel." Another replied, "Then maybe we should have trusted him on air too." It was clear, this wasn't just a PR crisis, it was a reckoning. ABC tried to make amends by inviting black journalists and cultural commentators to guest host panels the following week, but it felt reactionary. Audiences knew the difference between tokenism and real accountability. Asterisk, even Hollywood started shifting. Several actors who had quietly endured hostile interviews now felt empowered to speak out. Mahershala Ali tweeted, "Denzel took that mic off for all of us." The caption, "Real recognizes real." Period. Soon, an informal coalition began to form a network of artists pushing for new standards around how black creatives were interviewed, discussed, and framed in media. They weren't calling for censorship. They were demanding equity. It wasn't just about what questions were asked. It was about who got asked and why. The industry had made assumptions for decades. Now, those assumptions were under fire. Asterisk, George eventually returned to air the following Monday, his face noticeably tight. He began the show with a carefully written statement. "Last week, during a segment with Mr. Denzel Washington, I failed to uphold the tone of conversation that Good Morning America stands for. I apologize to Mr. Washington, to our viewers, and to the broader creative community. We value our guests and regret that this interview did not reflect that." The apology was short, corporate, and for many, insufficient. Denzel didn't respond. Publicly, he didn't need to. His walkout had already said everything. The most striking aftermath came weeks later when Denzel gave a surprise speech at the NAACP Image Awards. Standing at the podium, holding a Lifetime Achievement Trophy, he looked directly into the audience. "Legacy," he said, "is not built by playing polite. Legacy is built when you say the truth out loud, even when it costs you the room." The crowd stood in ovation before he even finished. Later in the speech he added, "I don't walk off stages. I walk away from disrespect. That's the difference." The line made headlines across every outlet, some praising him, others suggesting he was too divisive, but no one could ignore him. Not anymore. Denzel's film opened with a record-breaking box office weekend, grossing nearly $120 million. Globally, critics praised the performance as commanding, soulful, and career-defining. But the story wasn't just on-screen. It was off-screen, too. It was about a man who had spent 4 decades mastering his craft and finally stopped letting others define the rules of engagement. Younger actors cited him as the reason they now demanded vetting of their interview questions. Directors reconsidered the tone of press junkets, and media training across networks quietly updated its guidance. Never assume your guest won't challenge the format. The industry had learned its lesson, or at least it knew it couldn't treat Denzel Washington like a passive prop in someone else's SER 3 weeks after the viral fallout. ABC decided to host a primetime specialer, live town hall segment titled The State of the Media, Trust, Truth, and Transparency, promoted as an effort to restore faith and reconnect with the audience. The program promised open discussion about race, respect, and the role of journalists. George Stephanopoulos would co-moderate, joined by Robin Roberts. But when it was announced that Denzel Washington had declined to participate, public interest waned. ABC scrambled to book high-profile names to fill the gap. Then came the announcement. Morgan Freeman would appear as a surprise guest and deliver opening remarks. That single news drop reignited viewership. Morgan's reputation as a voice of reason and gravitas gave the event unexpected weight. But what ABC didn't realize was that Morgan wasn't coming to play damage control. He was coming to say what Denzel didn't have to. The town hall opened to a somber tone. George read a carefully scripted monologue about journalistic responsibility. Robin tried to steer the energy toward redemption. But when Morgan Freeman walked on stage, the mood shifted entirely. He didn't smile. He didn't acknowledge applause. He went straight to the mic and said, "I came here tonight not to defend journalism, but to expose the parts of it that still don't know how to handle truth when it walks in wearing black skin." There was stunned silence. Then he added, "What you saw with Denzel was not an isolated moment, it was a mirror. You just didn't like what you saw staring back." Robin Roberts shifted in her seat. George looked down at his cue cards, but the audience leaned in. Morgan had everyone. He told a story from early in his own career. How a journalist once asked him whether he felt less threatening because of his voice. "I was 38 years old," Morgan said, "and I realized that day the problem wasn't how I sounded, it was that they assumed sounding safe meant being agreeable." He looked directly at George. "Denzel has never been unsafe, but you treated him like a threat because he wouldn't let you frame his answers for him." The audience applauded. Then came Morgan's most chilling line. "We have spent decades being polite in rooms that humiliate us in slow, subtle ways. Politeness is not peace, it's performance, and we're done performing." Robin Roberts quietly reached over and turned off her mic. She knew what Morgan was saying didn't need her defense. Midway through the broadcast, George attempted to pivot the conversation toward reconciliation. "Isn't there room for mutual understanding here?" he asked, gesturing toward the other panelists. But Morgan shut it down. Understanding is earned, not demanded, in a vacuum of accountability. He paused. "You want healing? Start with truth. And truth is Denzel was right to walk out, and you were wrong to corner him." The audience erupted in applause. The hashtag Morgan spoke trended within minutes. On Twitter, black journalists praised his clarity. Social media flooded with side-by-side clips, George confronting Denzel and Morgan confronting George. The contrast was devastating. ABC attempt at image rehabilitation had unintentionally given the movement its elder statesman. After the broadcast, the fallout was immediate. Viewers flooded ABC with comments, some praising the network for allowing Morgan to speak, others criticizing them for setting a trap. Sponsors backed off from the town hall's future segments. Within the network, senior producers began discussing whether George's presence on GMA had become a liability. Though he remained publicly supported by top brass, there were internal Whispers about succession planning. One executive anonymously told a media blog he's no longer seen as neutral. He's now part of the controversy. Meanwhile, Robin Roberts, who had chosen to remain silent during Morgan's remarks, received widespread praise for her restraint. Many believed she understood what George did in some moments aren't for you to redirect. Denzel, for his part, stayed quiet. He didn't post. He didn't give follow-ups. Instead, he focused on his next film, a historical thriller about a forgotten civil rights leader. But the world wouldn't let go. He became a reluctant symbol of boundary setting, of reclaiming public space, of refusing to be contained by corporate media expectations. College campuses began hosting panels titled The Denzel Moment, Black Authority in Public Spaces. Merchandise popped up online, t-shirts that read "Walked Out Like Denzel," coffee mugs with "Not Here for Disrespect." The cultural ripple effect was surreal. But more importantly, it sparked real introspection in media circles, particularly among young journalists dipped again.